Ever get that feeling like you want to really wrap your head around something? Really understand it, get to the bottom of it, but without having to wade through a ton of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what we're all about here. Today, we're diving into something that I think a lot of people are curious about, and that's male depression.
Mm,
It's something that touches a lot of lives, but it doesn't always get talked about as much as maybe it should be.
right.
So we've been going through a lot of articles, a bunch of research, trying to pick out what's really important, what's useful for you.
Yeah, I think it can be really overwhelming sometimes if you just go to Google and search and
That's my
then you
go.
get a million results, right?
Yeah.
So we're trying
Yeah.
to
Cut through all that.
exactly. That's our mission here, to really unpack this whole thing, male depression, and maybe reveal some things that you might not have known about, and also give you stuff that you can actually use, actionable advice and information.
Yeah, definitely. We want to go beyond just the surface, get into the nitty-gritty, but in a way that makes sense.
Yeah.
You don't need a PhD to understand this stuff.
Exactly. You don't need a medical degree or anything like that. Okay, so let's just jump right in. One of the things that really kind of struck me was that depression isn't just something that adults have to deal with.
Right.
It can show up a lot earlier than you might think, like even in childhood or definitely during those teenage years, puberty and adolescence.
Yeah.
And there was this one idea that really kind of stuck with me, that the acting out that you sometimes see in teenagers, that rebellious kind of behavior,
Hmm.
it might actually be a sign that there's some depression underneath.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point
Mm-hmm.
because it's not always just typical teenage angst.
Yeah.
It could be that something deeper is going on, and that's the way it's being expressed because, if they don't have the words or they don't feel safe to talk about their feelings, they might act out instead.
That really makes you rethink how we look at those behaviors in kids and teenagers, right? Yeah, for sure. It's a real call for us to pay closer attention and maybe see things from a different perspective.
And there's this other idea that I found really interesting, this thought that depression could actually be a healing emotion if we sort of learn how to work with it.
Yeah, that's a powerful concept, isn't it? It kind of turns our usual thinking on its head
Yeah, yeah,
because we usually see depression as something purely negative.
right.
But this perspective suggests that maybe, just maybe, our emotional responses, even the painful ones, can be sources of information, even guides to some kind of growth or healing.
Yeah. I know you've had some really powerful personal experiences that kind of informed your perspective on this.
Yeah, for sure. My parents separated when I was 12, and my dad, well, he had a lot of emotional struggles. He could be pretty abusive, really jealous. And looking back, I really believe he was probably dealing with undiagnosed and untreated depression.
Wow.
And over the years, working with people, I've seen that same kind of struggle play out in so many men's lives. It's heartbreaking.
It really makes you realize that behavior that might seem hurtful or damaging on the surface could actually be coming from a much deeper place of pain that isn't being acknowledged.
Absolutely. It's a reminder to try and look beyond just the outward actions and try to understand the internal struggles that might be driving them, especially with men.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I found really helpful in the material we were looking at was this idea of an emotional filter in depression.
Right. It's like wearing dark sunglasses on a sunny day.
Oh.
You're not in complete darkness, but the glasses block out a lot of the light. And depression can be like that. It's not that the world is actually dark, but it feels that way because of this filter. It distorts how you see things, how you feel things, even your spiritual feelings.
So those feelings of being disconnected or distant from things that used to matter, those are actually a symptom of the depression itself. It's not necessarily reflecting reality.
Right. And that's really important for people to understand. It's not that they've lost their faith or that they're somehow abandoned by a higher power. It's the depression making them feel that way.
Now, one of the big challenges with male depression that comes up again and again is this reluctance to admit it or to seek help. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think part of it is just the way men are often socialized. There's this expectation that you got to be strong, independent, you don't ask for help.
Yeah.
It's that whole macho thing.
Right. Don't show any weakness.
Exactly. And so admitting to feeling depressed can feel like a sign of weakness. It goes against that ingrained idea of what it means to be a man.
You also mentioned a really powerful memory from your own childhood that showed just how much early loss and trauma can impact someone.
Yeah, this is something I'll never forget. I came home from school one day and my mother had packed bags and she was leaving with my brother and me.
Wow.
It was during the war and fathers were being killed, so a lot of kids were experiencing loss. But for them, there was also this sense of pride. Their fathers were heroes. My pain, though, felt different. It was shameful. It was like my life was over. I even prayed that night to be taken to heaven. It was a really intense experience of what they call reactive depression.
That feeling of being so alone, like life has no purpose, that must have been incredibly difficult. But it sounds like things did eventually start to get better.
They did. My grandparents played a huge role in that. They created this really supportive, engaging environment for my brother and me during the holidays. My grandfather taught me all sorts of things: woodworking, fishing, even fixing cars. And we listened to gospel broadcasts every evening. Slowly, my soul started to heal.
It really shows the power of having positive influences in your life, people who support you, and also having things to do, things that engage you and give you a sense of purpose.
Absolutely. It's not always about directly confronting your pain all the time. Sometimes it's about creating space for positive experiences and finding ways to rediscover who you are.
So we've talked a bit about the psychological and social factors, but the research also points to biological factors that can contribute to depression in men. What are some of those?
Well, one thing that came up was what's sometimes called male menopausal depression, which is kind of like what women go through during menopause. It can seem to hit out of the blue.
Oh, interesting.
Then there's bipolar disorder, which is a more severe form of depression. It has a really strong genetic component and affects men and women pretty equally. And of course, the research acknowledges that women definitely experience their share of depression too. It's not just a male problem.
It's fascinating to look back at history and see how depression has affected people throughout time. The research mentioned some pretty remarkable men who struggled with it.
Yeah, people like King David, Spurgeon, Goethe, even Winston Churchill. These were guys who achieved incredible things, but they also battled these inner demons.
And this was back when there weren't really any effective treatments for depression.
Right. They were fighting these battles mostly on their own. And what's amazing is that so many of them were able to transcend those periods of darkness, even use their struggle as fuel for their accomplishments. Some historians even suggest that those bouts of depression might have helped to balance them out, keep them grounded. Churchill, for instance, famously called his depression his black dog. It was something he lived with his whole life, probably because of genetics.
And even Spurgeon, who was a powerful preacher and known for his strong faith, acknowledged that these fits of depression can happen to anyone, even those who seem strong and joyful.
It's a reminder that depression doesn't discriminate. It can affect anyone, regardless of their background, their achievements, or their faith.
Now, the material also helped me understand that there are different types of depression,
Right. It's not all the same.
not just one thing. So tell me about those.
Well, we looked at atypical depression, which tends to be more chronic. People with this type might feel excessively tired, oversleep, overeat, and it can be harder to treat, sometimes requiring multiple medications.
Then there's dysthymia, which is more like a low-grade depression that hangs on for years.
Oh,
It
okay.
used to be thought of as more of a personality trait, but now we understand it's biological and it's treatable.
The case study of Peter was really helpful in understanding some of the more subtle aspects of depression, especially this idea of diurnal mood variation.
Yeah, Peter's a good example of how what might seem like just a weird work schedule or some forgetfulness could actually point to something more serious. The key clue in his case was this diurnal mood variation, meaning his mood changed predictably throughout the day. He felt worse in the morning and gradually got better as the day went on.
Oh, so like a daily pattern to his mood.
Exactly. And he was actually afraid to go to bed because he knew he'd feel awful when he woke up.
Oh, wow.
So he'd stay up late, drink tons of caffeine, which just made things worse. His withdrawal, his distractibility, his down mood, it was all connected to this underlying low-grade depression. And the good news is, even these less severe forms of depression can respond really well to treatment. So there's hope.
Absolutely. There's always hope.
Now, what about families? Is depression something that can be passed down through generations?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of young guys don't want to even think about the possibility that they might inherit depression from their fathers.
Yeah, I can see that.
But the research doesn't really point to a specific depression gene that gets passed down from father to son. What's more important is how fathers cope with their own depression,
Okay.
because those learned behaviors, those coping mechanisms, can have a big impact on their sons.
So it's not so much about direct inheritance, but more about the environment and the patterns that are learned within a family.
Yeah, exactly. For example, pessimism, negative thinking. Those are things that can be passed down and create a kind of state of loss that can trigger reactive depression in their sons.
I see. So addressing your own mental health as a father isn't just good for you, it can also be really beneficial for your kids.
Absolutely. It's about breaking those cycles and fostering healthier emotional habits in the family.
We often hear that women are more prone to depression. What does the research say about men? Are there any real differences?
Well, interestingly, the research doesn't really support the idea that there are specific female-type genes that cause depression more in women than men. Now, psychologist Dr. Martin Seligman has a few theories about why women might report depression more often, having to do with their roles in society and how they're socialized. But the research we looked at suggests that these same theories can actually offer valuable insights into men's experiences with depression, too.
So while there might be differences in how depression manifests or how often it's reported, the underlying factors might actually be more similar between men and women than we think.
That's what the research seems to suggest.
Okay, let's talk about testosterone. Most people think of it as the male hormone related to sex drive and things like that.
Yeah, and it is definitely crucial for those things.
Yeah.
But testosterone also plays a role in mood, and the research links it to a potential kind of hidden depression.
Hidden depression, that's interesting.
Yeah. So big fluctuations in testosterone, especially very high levels, can actually create imbalances that can contribute to depression.
Oh,
And it's important for couples to find healthy ways to deal with differences in sexual desire. Reduced sexual desire is a common problem, and there are a lot of factors that can contribute to that.
so it's not just about low testosterone, it's also about how those fluctuations and the resulting dynamics in relationships can impact mental health.
Exactly. It's all connected.
The example of Ned and the magazine he found really stuck with me. It really highlights the connection between shame and depression.
Yeah, poor Ned. He found this magazine in his father's hiding place, and it triggered all these feelings of shame and guilt.
Mhm.
And even though he tried to suppress those feelings, they kept coming back, haunting him. It led to a cycle of secrecy and isolation, which is a classic sign of shame-induced depression.
It shows how powerful those internal moral conflicts can be.
hmm
Shame can be a really potent trigger for depression.
Absolutely. It can keep those negative thought patterns going and going.
Which brings us to the idea that we can actually think ourselves into depression.
Yes, it's called pessimistic rumination. It's basically dwelling on negative thoughts, replaying failures, constantly putting yourself down.
Yeah, I think we've all done that at some point.
We all have, but the problem is, when you do it all the time, it can create this sense of helplessness, like you're trapped, and that can lead to depression.
So our thoughts really do have power over our mood.
They do. But the good news is it works both ways.
Oh, okay.
If negative thinking can contribute to depression, then positive thinking can help to pull you out of it.
That's encouraging. Now, let's not forget that depression isn't just a mental thing. It can have very real physical symptoms too.
Right. And that's one of the reasons why depression is often misdiagnosed. People go to the doctor complaining of headaches, stomach problems, fatigue, aches and pains,
Yeah.
and they're looking for a physical explanation, which is understandable. But sometimes the underlying cause is actually depression.
So if you're having persistent physical symptoms that don't seem to have a clear cause, it's worth considering that depression might be a factor.
Absolutely. It's definitely something to talk to your doctor about.
The concept of masking depression is interesting. What are some ways men do this?
Well, there's the example of Robert, who buried himself in religious study as a way to avoid dealing with his depression.
Hmm.
Now, there's nothing wrong with finding comfort in your faith, but when it becomes a way to escape from your pain, that's when it can be a problem.
Right. Like using it as a shield.
Exactly. And in today's world, there are so many other ways men try to mask their depression work, hobbies, all sorts of distractions.
So depression can be really overt, but it can also be hidden beneath the surface.
Exactly. And that can make it even harder to recognize and address.
The case of Chris was a good example of how depression can show up in ways that we might not typically associate with it.
Yeah, Chris was irritable, having trouble sleeping, lost interest in things he used to enjoy. He was snapping at people at work, calling in sick more often. Classic signs of depression, but they weren't the typical sadness we often think of.
Hmm.
And while there was the possibility that he was dealing with some delayed grief over his father's death, the combination of all those symptoms suggested something more might be going on.
It just goes to show that depression in men can manifest in a lot of different ways.
Absolutely. It's not always so straightforward.
Now, there was an intriguing connection that the research made between anger and depression.
Yeah, it's about adrenaline. When you get really angry, your body releases a flood of adrenaline, which can actually temporarily override those feelings of depression.
So anger can be Like a quick fix.
In a way, yes, it creates a feeling of heightened energy, even a kind of rush. But the problem is it reinforces that anger as a coping mechanism, and that can lead to aggressive or even violent behavior.
So it's not a healthy solution in the long run.
Definitely not. It's crucial to find healthier ways to deal with those intense emotions.
The example of Fred and Johanna and their struggling business really showed the impact that stress can have on mental health.
Yeah, Fred was working insane hours trying to keep the business afloat, and that kind of chronic stress can really mess with your brain chemistry. It disrupts the balance of neurotransmitters, which are the chemicals that regulate your mood, and that can lead to serious depression.
It's a reminder that our physical and mental well-being are totally intertwined.
Absolutely. You can't separate the two.
Now, one of the big myths that the material tackles head-on is this idea of the unemotional male.
Oh, yeah, that's a harmful stereotype.
Mm,
The media often portrays men as these emotionless robots who only feel anger or humor or sexual desire. But that's just not true.
right.
Men have a full range of emotions just like anyone else, but they might not always express them openly because of societal pressures.
Yeah, there's that expectation that men need to be strong and stoic, always in control.
Exactly. Showing emotion can be seen as a sign of weakness. So men often end up bottling up their feelings, especially when they're depressed.
It creates this real dilemma where they're trying to be emotionally healthy, but also trying to fit into these narrow expectations of what it means to be a man.
It's a tough balance.
And to help break down these harmful stereotypes, the material actually debunks several common myths about feelings in general.
Yeah, like the idea that feelings are somehow primitive or untrustworthy, or that real men don't have feelings,
Right.
or that you should always prioritize logic over feelings.
No BS.
Right. The truth is, feelings are complex and important. They give us valuable information, even though they shouldn't always dictate our actions. And the idea that men shouldn't have feelings is just plain damaging.
It's about finding a healthy balance between logic and emotion.
Exactly.
Now, the discussion also looked at how culture influences how we express our feelings, and there were some really interesting comparisons to other cultures.
Yeah, it's fascinating. In some cultures, children are encouraged to express their emotions openly from a very young age. Like in some African cultures, mothers carry their babies almost constantly, intuitively responding to their needs and their expressions. But in our modern Western culture, we often end up teaching kids to suppress or even change their true feelings in order to get attention.
Oh, wow.
And that can lead to a lot of problems later on, like difficulty expressing emotions or expressing them in unhealthy ways.
It makes you realize how much our early experiences and the culture we grow up in shape our emotional landscape.
Absolutely. And the good news is, if it's learned, it can be unlearned.
Okay. Now, things get really interesting when we talk about what happens when the brain's wiring goes awry, so to speak.
Right. So when we talk about emotions and healthy emotional processing, we often assume that our ability to reason is intact.
Mm.
But under extreme stress, the neurochemistry of the brain can get out of whack. And sometimes the emotional part of the brain takes over, so to speak. So in those cases, just trying to talk through your feelings or understand them might not be enough.
So talk therapy might not be the answer for everyone.
Right. For some people, especially those with severe depression where there seems to be a strong neurological component, medication might be necessary to rebalance those brain chemicals.
I see.
The brain is incredibly complex, and our emotions are intimately connected to its workings.
Now, the role of rumination, that dwelling on negative thoughts, is highlighted as a real problem when it comes to depression.
Yeah. Rumination is basically your mind's way of trying to make sense of difficult feelings, but it can get stuck in a loop. And that's what prolongs depression, and in some cases, it might even be the cause of it.
It's like getting caught in a whirlpool of negativity.
Exactly. And learning how to break free from that cycle is crucial for recovery.
The material also delves into the challenges men often face with intimacy.
Yeah, a lot of men struggle with true closeness, especially when it comes to non-sexual affection. It can be hard for them to understand and navigate those feelings, especially after the honeymoon phase in a relationship is over. And then there's this dynamic where it can seem like men give intimacy to get sex, while some women give sex to get intimacy.
Oh, wow.
Wives often complain that their husbands aren't emotionally responsive enough, and men often stay silent, guarded in their marriages and even in their friendships.
So there can be a real disconnect between men and women when it comes to emotional intimacy.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a common problem.
And this leads into the discussion about whether traditional psychotherapy is always the best approach for men.
Right. A lot of men resist the idea of introspective therapy. They see it as too much navel gazing.
Mhm.
And they're skeptical about whether all that psychological insight will actually lead to any real change in their lives.
So they're looking for something more practical, more action-oriented.
Exactly. They want solutions, not just explanations.
Well, the good news is the material does offer some very practical strategies for increasing emotional intelligence.
Yeah, things like keeping a journal to reflect on your feelings, working on expanding your emotional vocabulary so you can actually articulate what you're experiencing,
Mm.
making time to consciously reflect on both your positive and negative feelings, spending time with people who are emotionally intelligent,
Mhm.
maybe even forming a support group where you can be honest and vulnerable with other guys.
Those are all great ideas.
It's about building emotional literacy and creating a supportive environment where men can actually grow in this area.
Okay. Now let's talk about antidepressants. There's often a lot of misunderstanding about them. What did the research say about their effectiveness?
Well, it's important to understand that with antidepressants, we're often aiming for a good response rather than complete remission of all symptoms.
Mhm.
A large percentage of people with biologically based depression can find significant relief through medication, often in combination with counseling, but it's important to be patient. It can take time to find the right medication and the right dosage, and it usually takes at least 2 weeks to start noticing any effects.
So it's not an instant cure.
Right. And it's really important to keep taking your medication even if you don't feel any changes right away. You also need to have your medication levels and liver function checked regularly,
Hmm.
and it's generally recommended to avoid alcohol while you're on antidepressants.
So it's a commitment.
It is, but for many people, it can be a real lifesaver.
The research also talks about something called stress-induced depression, or sometimes post-adrenaline depression.
Yeah, this is basically depression that's triggered by prolonged, intense stress.
Hmm.
It's almost like your body's way of trying to regain balance after being in a constant state of high alert.
Like burnout.
Exactly. It can actually be mistaken for chronic fatigue syndrome sometimes.
So stress can literally make you depressed.
It can. And that's why learning to manage stress is so crucial for both preventing and treating depression.
Now, the material offers some really practical strategies for reducing those negative thoughts and behaviors we all have.
Yeah, the first step is just becoming aware of those negative traits that you tend to fall back on.
Mhm.
Then pay attention to your negative thoughts, that inner critic that's always putting you down.
Oh, I know that voice well.
We all do. But the key is to catch yourself in the act, so to speak, and then at that moment, choose to do something different.
Okay.
Maybe apologize if you need to. Make a conscious decision to change that behavior next time.
So it's about taking control, making a choice.
Exactly. It's about actively shaping your thoughts and your actions.
And of course, lifestyle is a big factor in overall well-being.
Absolutely. The research talks about the possibility of actually turning bad stress into something good, and it emphasizes the importance of getting enough sleep, creating a calmer lifestyle, making time for rest and recovery.
Hmm.
All of those things can help prevent depression.
And what about spiritual development?
That's also crucial. Cultivating your spiritual side can give you a sense of connection to something bigger than yourself, which can be incredibly grounding and supportive, especially during difficult times.
It's that feeling of being part of something larger.
Exactly.
Now, the material makes this really helpful distinction between necessary and unnecessary losses.
Right. Necessary losses are those unavoidable parts of life that we all go through,
Hmm.
like the end of childhood, leaving home, your kids growing up and moving out, even things like losing your hair as you get older.
Yeah, those are just part of life.
Exactly. They're necessary for growth and development. Unnecessary losses, though, are those that could have been avoided, and those can be a lot harder to deal with.
So it's about learning to accept the things you can't change and focusing your energy on the things you can.
Right.
Now, what about dealing with disappointed dreams?
Oh, that's a tough one.
It is.
The reality is not all our dreams are going to come true. And when a dream fizzles out, it's important to grieve that loss. Let it go, and then start fresh with new dreams. Even in midlife and beyond, it's important to have goals and aspirations that give you a sense of purpose.
It's about adapting, finding new directions, and rediscovering what gives your life meaning.
Exactly.
The research also lists some common sources of disappointment that men often face.
Yeah, things like the pressure to succeed, sexual disappointments in marriage, feeling disillusioned with your work, even if it's outwardly successful, and also just general disappointments in relationships that go beyond sex.
So there are a lot of potential pitfalls out there.
There are, but just being aware of them can help you navigate those challenges more effectively.
Now let's talk about reactive depression and the whole process of grieving.
Reactive depression is basically the depression that follows a loss.
Hmm.
And that loss can be a real tangible loss, like the death of a loved one, or it can be a more symbolic loss, like a job or a relationship.
Okay.
It can even be an anticipated loss, something you're dreading that might happen in the future.
So it's all about how we process loss.
Exactly. And grief work, allowing yourself to feel those emotions associated with loss, is essential for healing.
And the Christian faith offers some unique resources for dealing with grief.
Yes. The concepts of faith and the Holy Spirit, the belief in a life beyond this earthly one, those can be incredibly comforting and supportive during times of loss.
So there's a spiritual dimension to healing as well.
Absolutely.
The research also describes what might be considered an ideal response to loss in terms of depression. What does that look like?
Well, ideally, you'd have an initial onset of depression after the loss, then a gradual deepening of those feelings depending on how significant the loss is.
Hmm.
Then those feelings would level out, and eventually you'd start to recover as you begin to let go. And finally, the depression would lift as you come to terms with the loss.
So it's a process, a natural progression.
It is. It takes time.
The example of sending out those rejection letters to grad school applicants really showed how even something that might seem like a minor disappointment can trigger this whole process of loss and reaction.
Yeah, those letters represent so much more than just a missed opportunity. They represent dashed hopes, wasted time, uncertainty about the future.
Mhm.
And for the people receiving them, it can be a real blow to their self-esteem, even their faith.
It highlights the importance of acknowledging the emotional impact of any kind of disappointment, even if it might not seem like a traditional loss.
Exactly. Feelings are feelings.
And this section ends with a really powerful message about the importance of grieving, both for men themselves and for the boys they're raising.
Yeah, men need to have the courage to grieve, to let those emotions out, and they need to teach their sons to do the same.
It's about breaking down those stoic barriers and allowing ourselves to be human.
Exactly. It's about raising emotionally healthy men who can face life's challenges with resilience and compassion.
Now let's move into midlife. The research talks about the male midlife blues and this potential for a loss of meaning during this stage of life.
Yeah, a lot of men reach midlife and start to question everything.
Mm.
They feel a sense of emptiness, a lack of purpose, and that can be really unsettling. It's like what King Solomon said, he who has plenty is filled with disgust.
It's that feeling of, is this all there is?
Exactly.
And then there's the whole issue of declining testosterone levels in midlife and the link to depression.
Right. Testosterone is a mood-boosting hormone, so when levels start to drop, it can definitely impact your mood. And it's not just about sex drive.
Mhm.
Testosterone plays a role in a lot of bodily systems, including emotional stability.
I see.
So those hormonal changes can be a real factor in midlife depression, as well as things like erectile dysfunction.
And luckily, it's something that can be tested for and potentially addressed.
Absolutely. There are treatments available.
The research also outlines several other common causes of midlife crisis.
Yeah, there's the crisis of values, where you start to question your beliefs and your purpose.
Mm.
There can be a crisis in the marriage, feeling disconnected, unloved, bored. There can be a crisis related to kids, either disappointment in how they're turning out, or just that empty nest feeling when they leave home.
Yeah.
There's the vocational crisis, where you start to feel unfulfilled in your work, even if you're successful.
Like you've climbed the wrong ladder.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's the crisis with aging parents having to take on more responsibility for their care. And finally, there can be a spiritual crisis where you start to question your faith.
Wow, so midlife can be a real minefield.
It can. It's a time of transition and change, and those transitions can be really challenging.
Yeah, the material also talks about the role of faulty thinking in depression.
Yeah, we often focus on the biochemical aspects of depression, which are definitely important.